Hello, class. Today's topic is photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is one of those big sciencey terms that's hard to spell and hard to pronounce. You've probably been talking about this since elementary school, but even though you've heard about this so many times, you probably don't really understand what it is, and that's okay. Today, we're going to talk about what you need to know, what are the basics you need to know about photosynthesis for regular biology. Well, first of all, we'll just break down the word. Like I said, it's a big word, and if we break down the parts, we see that we have photo, which is Greek for light, and synthesize, which means to make. And essentially, photosynthesis is a process, sort of like following a recipe. It's a process for making food, essentially. We get energy from the food that we eat. And so this is the process for how that food is created. And it's made using energy from light. So it's gonna be very interesting. We know that plants are capable of doing photosynthesis, but there are other forms of life on Earth as well that are also able to do photosynthesis. So there are many photosynthetic protists, which are single-celled organisms, and bacteria, which are also single-celled organisms but prokaryotes. In fact, most of the photosynthesizers on the planet are actually bacteria. They're called cyanobacteria. They were also the first photosynthesizers in Earth's history, and they live in the ocean. So they far outnumber anything else that lives on the land because the oceans take up 70% of the Earth's surface. So there's a lot of photosynthesis happening on this planet, in the oceans, on the land, etc. So this brings us to energy, because what we're essentially doing is we're making food, we're changing matter, but in order to do that, we're actually changing energy as well. Now, energy is not tangible. It's not something that you can hold or put in a box. But we need it to function in order to do anything. So energy isn't created or destroyed, but it just changes form. So in photosynthesis, we're going to have energy that starts out in the form of sunlight, and it's going to be converted into chemical energy by storing it into the bonds of molecules. The energy molecule that we're going to be focusing on for today's lesson is glucose, which is a simple sugar that is produced in photosynthesis. Now, sunlight is a source of energy, but we can't use it. We as humans can't use it. So if we could, essentially, with the next time you're hungry, you could essentially just sit under the sun and then warm up a little, and then you're full. We aren't able to do that. So when we want chemical energy, we actually need to eat food and then break that down. But we'll talk about plants, which can do photosynthesis. What they can do is they can take that energy from the sun and use that to convert molecules into food. So we're going to talk about how that happens. In order to understand this, we have to have a little understanding of chemical reactions and chemistry. So I'm giving you an example here. If we look over here, we see sugar and flour and eggs and vanilla and baking powder, all these things that go into the making of a cake. And we see a cake down here as our end product. Now, in a recipe, we call these things ingredients. Well, in a similar way, photosynthesis is like a recipe. It's a process that is step by step that's followed to make something in the end. Now, in chemistry, we don't use the term ingredients. We instead use the term reactants. So the things that are going into this process of photosynthesis are going to be called reactants. And they're like the ingredients of a chemical reaction. The end results are called the products. Sometimes there's waste products and sometimes there's main products. So in this recipe of photosynthesis, we're going to see an example of a main product that's produced and also a waste product. So in order to figure out what the ingredients are, we just need to think about what do plants need. So we've known about this since maybe even before elementary school, but we know that plants need light. What else do they need? Well, how many of you have ever had a plant at home? You had to water it. So we know light, water, and the other thing that we probably know is that plants need something from the air. And we know that plants need a gas that's sort of, we call it almost the opposite of what we need. We think we need oxygen and then we get rid of carbon dioxide. Well, plants need carbon dioxide. So those three things end up being the reactants of photosynthesis. Plants need water, they need sunlight, and they need carbon dioxide. So what gets produced in the end? What are the products? Well, as I said, there is a main product, and that main product is glucose. Also, there's a waste product. Now, this waste product is actually something that's important for us. It's oxygen gas. But the first photosynthesizers didn't need that, so it ended up being a waste product, and it's actually the reason why there's so much oxygen in the atmosphere today. It's because of photosynthesis. But we will end up using that oxygen as well as the glucose, which we'll talk about in our next lesson. Anyway, let's put together the reactants and the products into a chemical equation. And just like this tattoo over here, we see a chemical equation. Instead of using an equal sign, we use an arrow, which represents the process. I'm not balancing this equation because that's not something we need to focus on in this class. But this is a way that you can just remember what are the things that go into photosynthesis and what are the things that come out. Well, water, energy from the sun, and carbon dioxide all go into this process. Glucose and oxygen gas come out of this process. Now, photosynthesis happens primarily in the leaf cells of plants. So we're going to focus on plants instead of single-celled organisms. If we remember from our cell unit, we talked about an organelle called the chloroplast. That's the specific organelle where photosynthesis happens. And chlorophyll is the green pigment that traps light energy. So it's because of chlorophyll that it's even able to happen, and chlorophyll ends up looking green, so that's why we associate photosynthesis with green organisms. This was originally a game, but for this video I just want to show you the diversity of leaves. Okay, any kind of plant has leaves in order to do photosynthesis, but as you can see, we've seen leaves like these. Even evergreen trees have needles. Cacti have spines. These are still leaves. So we see that evolution has allowed the development of all kinds of leaves. Grass, the blades of grass are leaves. A Venus flytrap. This is a great tidbit. Everyone always asks me, are Venus flytraps carnivores? They're called carnivorous plants because they actually break down insects and other organisms in order to get nutrients. They happen to live in soil that's very nutrient poor, and so they have evolved a unique way of getting nutrients. However, they are still producers, and their primary means of obtaining energy is photosynthesis. This, what looks like a mouth, is actually a modified leaf and is still capable of doing photosynthesis. We see the sepals on a flower are still leaves. A strawberry plant has leaves to get energy. And then we need to think about what happens to the glucose at the end. So we have these plants or these organisms that are producing glucose. Well, that very same organism can break down that glucose next to get energy in a process called cellular respiration. We're going to learn about that next. Or it could be built up into larger molecules like starch for storage. Starch is actually made up of hundreds to thousands of glucose molecules all strung up in a row. Or the plant might be eaten and then whatever eats the plant, like that might be us eating the plant, uh, then that organism breaks down the glucose for energy, again in the process called cellular respiration, which we'll learn later. So that's the end. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please bring any questions you have to class.